and we are on the record for hearings and the matters listed in the North Dakota Industrial Commission hearing docket for Friday, April 28th, 2023. I am Stephen Nelson, hearing examiner for these hearings. We are at the hearing room for the Department of Mineral Resources, Oil and Gas Division, and it is 9 o'clock a.m. There are two cases on the docket today. I'm going to consolidate the two cases for hearing purposes, and the records in these cases will be consolidated. However, the commission may still issue separate orders in these cases. I'm going to allow the applicant to present its entire case in these matters, and after that, I will invite anyone who is present today and wishes to testify to come forward and provide testimony. There is a sign-up sheet for people present in the hearing room today. After the applicant finishes presenting its case, I'll be calling names in the order from the sign-up sheet. You must appear at the time you are called, or you'll be moved to the end of the list. I will call the cases now. Case number 30043. In the matter of the petition of Foundation Energy Management, LLC, for an order of the Commission providing for the unitized management, operation, and further development of the Camel Hump Red River Unit located in Golden Valley, County ND, for approval of the unit agreement and the unit operating agreement constituting the plan of unitization for the Camel Hump Red River Unit, for approval of the plan of operation, for vacation of the applicable spacing order, and for such other and further relief as the Commission deems appropriate. And case number 30044. In the matter of the petition of Foundation Energy Management, LLC, for an order of the Commission determining that the unit agreement and unit operating agreement constituting the plan of unitization for the Camel Hump Red River Unit, Golden Valley County, ND, has been signed, ratified, or approved by lessees and royalty owners owning the required percentage of working interest and royalty interest within said unit. Will all interested parties please come forward?
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Wade Mann, P.O. Box 2798, Bismarck, North Dakota, appearing in these cases on behalf of Foundation Energy Management, LLC. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Lawrence Bender, P.O. Box 1855, Bismarck, North Dakota, appearing in these consolidated matters on behalf of the Armstrong Corporation, William S. Bergner Incorporated, and Rock Resources, Inc.
Mr. Mann, you may.
Yeah, Mr. Examiner, I'll have three witnesses that I'm going to have testify in these cases, and it will be Lee Garvey. He'll testify as to land-related issues and the unit agreement and unit operating agreement. Stephen Zagurski, he'll go through and address geology-related issues and the geology exhibits. And then Mr. Tyler Stallcup will address the engineering-related matters associated with the proposed units. Pre-filed the exhibits, unit agreement, unit operating agreement. I have passed around hard copies of what is the pre-filed exhibits and both the unit agreement and unit operating agreement, and that's what we intend to rely on with respect to exhibits for this hearing.
All right. Mr. Examiner, I noticed that we do have a number of numbered exhibits. The unit agreement and the unit operating agreement are not numbered. Could we?
Yeah, I don't know if it just makes sense to, I mean, if we want to, they were attached as exhibits to the petition, but if we want to identify those as specific numbered exhibits, maybe it makes sense to, I think we ended at exhibit 28. If we could make the unit agreement exhibit number 29 and the unit operating agreement exhibit number 30.
Sure. Exhibit 29, exhibit 30. I think that makes sense. All right, and so I guess, do you want me to swear in your first witness, or do you have any opening statements you want?
No, I don't have really any opening statement or comments.
Okay, I'll go ahead and swear you in. Mr. Garvey, please make sure your mic is on. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Lee, can I have you state your name and give us your business address?
Yeah, my name is Lee Garvey. Business address is 5057 Keller Springs Road, Suite 650, Addison, Texas 75001.
And Lee, who do you work for?
Foundation Energy Management, LLC.
And what's your position with Foundation?
Land manager.
Okay. And have you previously testified before this commission?
Yes.
And was that on land-related matters?
Correct.
Okay, and did you have your qualifications received as that of an expert?
Yes.
Okay. And Lee, are you familiar with the proposed Camel Hump Red River unit?
Yes.
Okay. And were you involved in the preparation of the petition for unitization as well as the unit agreement and unit operating agreement?
Yes.
Okay. I'd move the testimony of Mr. Garvey be received as that of an expert in this case.
No objection.
The testimony will be received as that of an expert.
And Lee, I think, why don't we just go ahead and, if I could have you identify what the proposed unit boundaries are?
Sure. Well, it's identified in Exhibit A to the unit agreement, but to be more specific, it is 800 acres consisting of all of Section 24 and the north half of Section 25 in Township 141 North, 104 West in Golden Valley County, and all within Camel Hump Field. So there are 2 wells that have currently been drilled within the proposed unit boundary. There's the Wurtzfeld 2124 well and the Plinus 24-24 well. The proposed unitized area includes 2 tracts. So tract 1 is going to be the north half, and the north half of the south half of Section 24, consisting of 480 acres, which is the spacing unit for the entire Wurtzfeld well. And then the second tract is going to be the south half of Section 24, and the north half of Section 25, consisting of 320 acres, which is also the spacing unit, the current spacing unit for the Plinus well.
Okay. And Lee, I know we've identified Exhibit A to the unit agreement. We also have some other land maps that really show the proposed unit. Why don't we walk through those real quick, beginning with Exhibit number 1?
Sure. Well, you can see the entirety of Section 24 and then the north half of 25, which consists of that 800 acres I just recently identified. That is going to be the proposed unit.
Sure. And then moving on to Exhibit number 2, is that I guess that would be Tract 2 that you've got highlighted, the spacing unit for the, current spacing unit for that pline as well?
That is correct.
And then what would be Tract 1 you've got
Tract-
in Exhibit 3?
Yep. So Tract 1 would be the 480 acres identified as the Wurtzfeld unit, being the north half of Section 24 and the south half of Section 24.
Okay. And then moving on to Exhibit number 4, you have the entirety of the proposed unit boundary depicted?
Correct.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move forward then. Can you just briefly explain, what the purpose of the proposed unitization is?
Sure. It's EOR, Enhanced Oil Recovery, or Secondary Oil Recovery.
Okay. And Lee, I think you indicated you were involved in the unit operating agreement. Were you primarily responsible for kind of getting those put together?
Yes.
And I think you understand that the unitization statutes have certain requirements with respect to a plan of unitization, and I want to kind of go through and touch on some of those requirements and where you've got those issues addressed in the unit agreement, unit operating agreement. So, first off, does the plan of unitization address the designation and authority of a unit operator?
It does. And the unit operating agreement would be under Article 7 and Article 8.
Okay. And then moving on, does the plan of unitization also have formulas for the allocation of production among the separately owned owners in each of the tracts within the unit?
It does, and that will be found on the unit agreement in both Articles 5 and 6. And I'll have Tyler talk about that here in just a minute.
Go into kind of the details as to how you arrived at that allocation and how it'll work.
Sure.
Then moving on, does the plan of unitization account for the manner in which the expenses for the unit and further development and operation will be apportioned?
It does, specifically under Unit Operating Agreement Article 12.
Okay. And does the plan of unitization have a procedure to establish which wells, equipment, and other properties of the several lessees within this unit are to be taken over and used for operations?
It does, and that would be also under Unit Operating Agreement Article 11.
Okay. And does the plan address the creation of an operating committee for general overall management and control of the unit?
It does, and it would be Unit Operating Agreement, Article 5.
Okay. And does the plan address the effective date on which the unit will move forward?
It does, under Unit Agreement, Article 15.
Okay. And how about termination and winding up of a unit?
Yes, again, under Unit Agreement, Article 16.
And Lee, if the commission were to approve this unit, when is Foundation looking to try to get development started?
As soon as possible upon approval from all governing agencies.
Okay. And you understand that in order to get the unit approved, you have to have 50%, or 55% ratifications from the royalty owners and working interest owners?
Correct.
Okay. Can you just give us an update where we're at with that?
We have the threshold from the working interest owners. It's our belief that we own, and I could be off a couple percentages, but roughly around 65% in the unit for working interest. And then as far as the royalty owners to date, I believe we've accounted for about 25%.
Yep. And we're looking at finalizing to get the remaining 55%, and you'll file that once it's secured?
Correct.
Okay. I have no further questions for Mr. Garvey at this time. I'd offer the land exhibits, which would be exhibits 1 through 4, and then the unit agreement and operating agreement, which are 29 and 30.
Any objection, Mr. Bender? Or-
No objection.
The exhibits are admitted. And did you have any cross-examination?
Yeah, I have a few questions. Mr. Garvey, I'm Lawrence Bender. I represent, as you know, the Armstrong Corporation, William S. Bergner, and Rock Resources. I have a few questions for you. First of all, in these materials, I couldn't point to it right now if I had to, but I thought I saw the name of Paul Connor or Paul Connors. Does that name mean anything to you?
Yes, he's a consultant for us, helping us with sending out the ratifications and unit joiners.
Was he involved in putting together the unit agreement and the unit operating agreement?
No,
Okay, that was all done in-house by you and your team. Is that a
Correct.
fair statement? Okay.
general counsel.
And what was your involvement in, well, strike that. Let's go to Exhibit B of the unit agreement, which I think has been marked as Exhibit number 29.
I'm sorry, what agreement?
Exhibit B,
On the unit agreement or operating agreement?
unit agreement. I think they're the same in both the unit agreement and the unit operating agreement, but I'm going to have questions on the unit agreement first. And just tell me when you're there. It's a multi-page document. Looks like it's comprised of 7 pages.
Is that Copus?
No, it's on the unit agreement, not the unit. Yep, so Exhibit B. Yep, right after that.
Right behind the map.
Yep, right there.
Okay.
Are you there, Mr. Garvey?
Yes.
Okay. Looking at page 1 of the, of this document, Exhibit B, I see a heading called Basic Royalty and Percentage, and then after that, there's a list of different owners. Would those be mineral owners?
Correct.
Okay. And then off to the side, it says, off to the left-hand side, it says expiration and date of lease. Do you see that?
Correct.
Okay. And I see a number of the leases are dated, I guess that's the expiration date, but it's, the first one is March 3rd of 2025. State is HBP, then there's a number of other ones that are dated, 2025 is the expiration date, and 2024. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, this well, the, can't remember, what's the name of the well? That's
The Wirtzfeld.
Yeah, thank you. This well was drilled, 2012, 2013, is that correct?
I don't have an exact date,
Yeah.
but
But long before 2023.
yes,
So these would be new leases, is that correct?
correct.
So when that well was drilled, it was drilled under older leases.
Correct.
And since those leases expired, your company went out and purchased new leases, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And if I go over to the left, to the right-hand column, I see the working interest and percentage. That reflects ownership of the leasehold estate under the new leases. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, yes.
Okay. Would you admit that at the time the well was drilled, the Armstrong Corporation owned an interest in the leasehold estate and participated in drilling of the well?
Yes,
And would you agree that William S. Bergner, or his predecessor in interest, the Burco Resources, was an owner and participated in drilling of the well?
I can't confirm that, but
What about Rock Resources or its predecessor?
I wouldn't be able to confirm that at the moment.
You don't have any information to suggest that those two parties did not participate in the drilling of the initial well?
I believe we have a drilling title opinion that would reflect that. I'd have to confirm.
When you prepared Exhibit B to the unit agreement, did you search title then from patent to present, or did you use the title opinion and just update that material?
We did a full examination of title. We ran the recent title opinion forward and created a new title opinion.
And were you involved in the preparation of the, I'm going to call it the participation formula, and I can direct your attention to it on where it is in the unit agreement, but were you involved in coming up with the parameters for that participation formula?
No,
Okay. But you're aware of the fact that the participation formula for Phase 1 is 10% usable well bores and 90% current production? Are you
Correct.
not?
correct.
Okay. And are you also aware that when participation formulas are put together, the idea is that in Phase 1, when you're producing primary oil, there's an attempt with the participation formula to keep the parties in the same position as they would be as if primary production continued. Do you understand that?
Correct.
And you understand that in Phase 2, when we're talking about secondary production, the idea is to put the parties in a position when you're moving oil around so that they recover their fair and equitable share of the reservoir. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And right now, do you understand that the only well that is producing is the Polinas well?
Correct.
And so there's no production at all from the Wurzfeld well, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So currently, all the oil that's being produced in your proposed unit area is being allocated to the Polinas owners, is that correct?
I believe there's some allocation into the Wurtzfeld.
Okay. Can you tell me on what basis there'd be an allocation to Wurzfeld owners?
That would be a question better suited for Tyler.
Now, I'm talking about pre-unitization, not post-unitization, but you believe right now there is revenue being allocated to owners under the Wurzfeld tract. Is that your testimony?
Yes,
Okay. But you don't know what basis that is?
I don't.
But you think, I mean, you're the landman, but you think an engineer will be able to answer that question, and you cannot?
Yes,
Okay. Do you know how much percentage is being allocated to the Wurzfeld tract from the Polinas well?
I don't. Not off the top of my head. I'd have to examine this a little further. My apologies.
Well, let's continue, and perhaps this is another question that's going to have to be directed to the engineering witness. But what benefit will the Wurzfeld well generate to the primary production of this proposed unit?
Well, it's going to be our injection well,
Right?
and so the primary benefit from the injection well would be to supplement the production for the Plinus.
And perhaps I didn't word my question very carefully. I'm talking about primary production, not necessarily the term you used, primary benefit. What benefit during primary production will the Wurzfeld well have to this proposed unit?
I don't necessarily understand the question.
Okay? If you have primary production, that's production that doesn't require any energy being added to the reservoir. Would you agree to that?
Correct.
That's production that's going to be produced regardless of whether there's unitization, correct?
Correct.
So if you're not injecting water into the unit, you're just recovering primary production, what benefit does an injector well, what benefit does an injector well provide to the unit for primary production?
It doesn't.
Okay? Yet, if I look at your participation formula, you've provided 10% of the allocation formula to usable well bores, correct?
Correct.
So that means 5% of the production is going to be allocated to Tract 1, even though that well will not benefit primary production, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And the other 90% of the allocation formula for Tract 1 and Phase 1, or excuse me, not Tract 1, but the other 90% of allocation will be based on current production, is that correct?
Yes.
And the only production is from the Polinas well, correct?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about Phase 2 tract participation. Am I reading this correctly, that 10% of the formula is based on surface acreage?
Yes.
And how many acres of surface is there in Tract 1?
480,
And how many acres are there in Tract 2?
320.
And if you do the math on that, based on that 10% allocation, 60% will be allocated to Tract 1, is that correct?
Yes.
And 40% will be allocated to Tract 2,
Correct.
even though all of the production at this point in time and most of the production during Phase 2 will come from Tract 2, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's go back a little bit to Phase 1 again, where we're using usable well bores. Describe for me usable well bores.
Can you be more specific?
Well, tell me what a usable well bore is.
Something that, a wellbore that we can use during our operations that's going to benefit the recovery of oil.
Okay, and as, in a definition of usable well bore, would you include surface equipment if there's anything there?
Yes.
And would you use downhole equipment,
Yes.
casing,
Yes.
tubing if it's still in the well?
Yes.
Anything else that's in the well?
Correct.
And I believe it was your testimony earlier that you believe, at least the Armstrong Corporation, and my understanding, you don't have any reason, you don't have any evidence to suggest that William Bergner and Rock Mullins had a working interest in this well when it was drilled, but they do not have a working interest in this well now, is that correct?
We believe they have a working interest as it pertains to the wellbore only.
Okay. So how are the Armstrong Corporation, Mr. Mullins, and Mr. Bergner being compensated for their interest in the wellbore interest if you don't reflect them as an owner in Tract 1?
I'm not sure I can answer that question right now.
Okay. Is there going to be any effort to write them a check for their proportionate share of that well, since they paid for their proportionate share of that well,
Write them a check in what regards?
for their interest in the wellbore that they paid for when it was drilled? I mean, you don't allocate any production to them. I'm wondering if you're going to write them a check for their interest in the well.
I don't know if I can answer that question at the moment.
But in any effect, the way your participation formula is drafted right now, the Armstrong Corporation, William Bergner, and Rock Mullins would receive no benefit for their ownership in the wellbore. Is that correct?
If in fact they have an interest in the original wellbore for the Wurtzfield, perhaps it's something we need to amend. That wasn't the intention, to leave anyone who had an existing working interest out of the wellbore per se.
Okay, now you're saying if they had an interest, but I think your testimony earlier was you thought they had an interest.
Correct.
Okay, and you still think they have an interest, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have right now, Mr. Examiner.
Are any questions from commission staff?
Lee, are you the one that's going to be answering questions on the unit agreement and unit operating agreement?
Yes.
Okay. On page 4 of the unit agreement, there's a definition of unitized substances. You there?
Yes.
It says that unitized substances are all oil, gas, gaseous substances, and sulfur contained in gas. Why is that listed? There's some other things listed also, but why does it say sulfur contained in gas?
Just as a catch-all.
But the sulfur would be a gaseous substance, wouldn't it, or and associated? I mean, I'm just wondering why I don't typically see that called out, sulfur.
No particular reason. I believe we included it as a catch-all, just to cover our bases, to make sure that everything was included.
Is there any substantial sulfur in the gas?
I don't know.
Going to page 6, Article 5, that's the tract participations. Typically, when we look at Phase 1, as was pointed out earlier in Cross, this is to benefit those owners for primary production. And typically, we see a large percentage attributed to primary production, remaining primary, excuse me. So I'm curious why remaining primary wasn't included in there.
I believe that's a question for better suited for Tyler. Be the expert on that
Okay.
particular question.
And in Phase 2, which is typically associated with oil due to EOR project and EOR secondary potential, it has in there a 90% remaining recoverable oil in place. What is the definition of remaining recoverable oil in place?
I would say that it's the oil that is still in the reservoir that we're trying to extract it from.
Is that an answer that Tyler should be given?
Probably.
Okay. And when you go from Phase 1 to Phase 2, you have a 584,090 barrels. After that cumulative amount has been produced from the unit, including from day one in primary, then it flips over to Phase 2. But when I go back and look at other documents that you filed, they don't agree with, like for instance, Exhibit 18, where it talks about remaining primary, and you look at what the EUR is of the wells. Is that also something Tyler should be answering?
Exhibit 18.
I don't mean to go into that exhibit yet. I'm just saying that later on in your testimony, when you cover 18, that number doesn't agree with this number going from Phase 1 to Phase 2.
Okay. Yes, that would be a question better suited for Tyler.
Okay? Now I'm going to the unit operating agreement. Page 2. You there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm looking at Article 3. 3.1 says Phase 1 unit operations, and it says all unit operations conducted during the Phase 1 track participation, okay?
Okay.
Phase 2 is under 3.2. It says all operations conducted during Phase 1 track participation. That should be Phase 2, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then under 3.4, it's talking about Phase 2 unit working interest. The last sentence there says, accordingly, Phase 1 unit working interest of the working interest owners is set forth in Exhibit D. That should be Phase 2, right?
Correct.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Bruce? I'm not sure that or Mr. Hicks. could you-
Yeah, it's under 3.4, the last sentence, and it's talking about Phase 2 unit working interest, although it says accordingly the Phase 1 unit working interest, and it should be Phase 2.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to page 5 of the unit operating agreement. This is where it identifies the unit operator and the removal.
Yep.
Under 7.2, it talks about resignation or removal of the unit operator. And it states in the second sentence, unit operator may be removed at any time by the affirmative vote of working interest owners having 70% or more of the voting interest remaining after excluding the voting interest of the unit operator. Under our statute 380809.4, it states that the unit operating agreement must contain a provision that the owners of a single majority of the working interest in the unit may vote to change the unit operator.
Okay.
So that's going to have to be amended.
Okay.
7.3, the third, well, it's the third row there. It talks about, can be changed by a majority of the phase toll. Of course, that should be Phase 2, right? TWO. Okay. And then the last sentence, it states there that by the affirmative vote of working interest owners having 60% or more of the voting interest, after excluding the voting interest of the removed unit operator, you can vote for a new one. That again can't be 60%. It's got to be pursuant to 380809.4, so it has to be a single majority.
Okay.
Now I'm in the Copus, page 3, which is Exhibit E to the unit operating agreement. You there?
Yes.
Okay. 3B talks about interest. It says, except as provided below, each party shall pay its proportional share of all bills in full within 15 days of receipt date. If payment is not made within such time, the unpaid balance shall bear interest compounded monthly at 18% interest. Out of all the unit agreements I've seen, I don't ever recall seeing something so high. It's almost always tied to prime rate plus 1 or 2% or.
Okay.
And I'm wondering why 18%. It almost seems like a penalty to me to be that high.
Right, and it was something provided to us by our general counsel. I can go back and revisit that. Just make a note.
Okay, well, we will want some supplements submitted on this to, in an attempt by you to to justify what you're wanting. Like I said before, typically it's prime rate plus a few percent.
Sure.
A lot of times it's 1 or 2 or 3%. Okay, that's all I've got in the unit agreement, unit operating agreement. Thank you.
Back to the unit agreement. Article 5, page 6 of the unit agreement.
Article 5,
Yep. Under both A and B, where you're identifying the phase 1 and 2 track participation, the second kind of line under there, it says unitized substance allocated to tract 1 and 2 are further allocated to the subtracts comprising tract 2 on an acreage basis.
correct.
Are there no subtracts in tract 1?
There are subtracts in tract 1.
So should that statement be tracts 1 and 2 on an acreage basis?
Most likely.
And I'm assuming the same same line in the phase 2 participation?
Correct.
Says the same thing, just says further allocated back to tract 2. I'm assuming it needs to be the subtracts of tract 1 and 2.
Okay.
And I will revisit the unit agreement on the unitized definition, but I'll wait until your geologist testifies for that. Sorry, I do have one other thing, and I am slightly jumping ahead, but I think you're the person to answer it anyway. Exhibit B of your unit agreement and Exhibit 15, and again, I know I'm jumping ahead on exhibits here, but Exhibit 15 on phase 1, the third listed entity on that is the Elaine Finnis, David Sandvik, Louis Hope, co-trustees of the Haldo and Alma Sandvik Family Mineral Trust. It says Haldo there. The same entity on phase 2, I believe, says Haldor.
Oh, okay.
And then on Exhibit B in your unit agreement, I believe they're listed as Haldor. Both of them seem to be listed as Haldor. So am I correct in assuming that Haldo on the phase 1 in Exhibit 15 is a typo?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. That's on Exhibit 15, correct?
That's on Exhibit 15. Okay, thank you. I guess just to clarify, Exhibit 15 in the Phase 1 portion of that exhibit, which is the second or third page of the
Sure.
Exhibit 15.
Are there any further questions from commission staff? Seeing none? Any redirect, Mr. Mann, or?
No, Mr. Examiner.
Mr. Examiner, as a result of Mr. Hicks's questions, I do have a follow-up or two, if I may. Mr. Garvey, directing your attention again to the unit operating agreement, which I think is Exhibit 30, and to Article 3. Can you tell me, well, let me back up. One of the plans for unitization, as I understand it, is to recomplete the current well in Tract 1 into an injector well. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that will be done during Phase 1. Is that correct?
Correct.
And how will those costs and expenses be allocated? Will they be allocated on a Phase 1 allocation basis, or will they be allocated on a Phase 2 allocation basis, given the fact they'll be in Phase 1 when that work is done?
I believe it would be Phase 1 allocation.
All right, so then I want to direct your attention to Exhibit D as part of the unit operating agreement. And page 1 of Exhibit D, near the bottom, there's a percentage of interest for rock resources. Do you see that?
Correct.
So you see Rock Resources in Phase 1 has approximately 8.5%, is that correct? Third from the bottom.
Right,
Okay, see Rock Resources having 8.5% in Phase 1.
correct.
So all of the costs and expenses that are incurred for the recompletion of the Hirschfeld well to an injector well will be allocated to Rock Resources at an 8.51% interest, is that correct?
I believe so.
But in Phase 2, recouping those expenses, when we get to Phase 2, it's only going to be able to, he's only going to recover 8.0%, is that correct?
Yes,
Will those expenses be recovered during the, during Phase 1, or will some of those expenses carry over into Phase 2?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Is that the same for the next page, Armstrong Corporation and William S. Bergner? Once again, do those two entities have a larger interest in Phase 1 than Phase 2?
Yes,
And is it also your answer that you don't know how, if the expenses for the recompletion would be, all be recovered in Phase 1?
correct.
Have you ever seen a unit operating agreement that has provisions in it that costs and expenses other than those that are in the nature of an investment are recovered in the same percentage as the phase that they're in, but if it's an investment, it all gets recovered in Phase 2?
I don't know.
You don't know if you've ever seen one?
Mm-mm.
Okay. No, no further questions.
Did that prompt any redirect, Mr. Mann, or do you want to move on to?
No, Mr. Examiner.
All right. Mr. Zugerski, please raise your right hand. And your mic on there. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Stephen, can I have you state your name and give us your business address?
Yes, sir. My name is Steven Zagurski.
Maybe
And-
spell it for the record.
Yes, sir. Steven spelled S-T-E-P-H-E-N. Last name Z-A-G-U-R-S-K-I.
And did you give us your business address?
I have not. It is 5057 Keller Springs Road, suite number 650, in Addison, Texas, zip code 75001.
And Stephen, who do you work for?
I work for Foundation Energy Management, LLC.
And what's your position with Foundation?
I'm a geologist.
Have you previously testified before this commission?
No, sir.
Why don't you just briefly walk us through your educational background and relevant work experience?
Yes, sir. A Master's of Science in Petroleum Geoscience from Rice University in Houston, Texas, and I have 4 years of relevant industry experience.
Okay. Are you familiar with the geology sort of associated with and underlying the proposed Camel Hump Red River unit?
Yes, sir, I am.
And did you have involvement and assist in preparation of the technical exhibits on the geology side?
Yes, sir.
I'd move the testimony of Mr. Zagurski be received as that of an expert in this case.
Testimony will be received as that of an expert.
And so, Stephen, let's go ahead and move on to those technical exhibits. If we could start with exhibit number 5 would be the first geology-related exhibit. If you can identify that and kind of take us through that exhibit.
Yes, sir. So, looking at Exhibit 5, what we have is a 3D seismic-derived subsea TVD structure map against the top of the Ordovician Red River Formation. From there, we have a polygon outline that is the closest within limits of the seismic extent of the porosity development defined as the Camel Hump Red River unit, the reservoir itself. From there, we have both the Paulinus wellbore, as shown in Section 25, and the Wartsfield wellbore, as shown in Section 24, in their to truest geographic position. From there, what we see is a generalized structural bed dip moving from southwest to northeast, and obviously the unit, current as they sit, unit tract outlines.
Okay. Let's move on to the next exhibit, number 6. Can you just tell us what that exhibit is and what you're trying to show in that exhibit?
Yes, sir. So in Exhibit 6, obviously, we have the delineation of the proposed unit tracks 1 and 2. From there, we have the polygon extent of our seismically derived porosity-enhanced reservoir. From some subsequent units, we have done our best efforts to generate an original oil-water contact as labeled on the Exhibit 6, and then from there, showing its relative reservoir extent in relation to both the Wurtzfeld wellbore and the Plinus wellbore.
Sure. Let's go ahead and move on then to exhibit number 6. If you can kind of walk us through that log for the Plinus well?
Just to confirm, you're
Or
referring to
excuse me,
Exhibit 7.
exhibit 7, my apologies.
Yes, sir. So this is the open hole logs running the Plinus 2424 wellbore upon initial completion of drilling. What we see here is porosity enhancement in the proposed stratigraphic interval of unitization being the Red River D. It also shows current active perforations within the completed wellbore.
And is this the log correct that was used for establishing the unitized formation definition?
Yes, sir, it was.
Let's move on to exhibit number 8.
Yes, so this is the, again, an open hole log from the Wurtzfeld wellbore. To make note, it is from the curve of the wellbore as it reaches its landing point at the Red River D stratigraphic interval. And relative formation tops, both in a measured depth and TVD sense, have been labeled on said log.
Okay. And then let's move on to exhibit number 9. If you can kind of walk us through the cross sections that you've got depicted here and what you're attempting to show with these.
Yes, sir. So the principle of Exhibit 9 with both the cross sections and their corresponding maps are to show relative Red River D reservoirs within the greater area of Golden Valley County. Things to note, the reservoirs themselves exhibit a slight strike orientation relative to bed depth, that being that there is a west-northwest to south-southeast orientation of the reservoirs, where bed depth within the basin is in a southwest-northeast orientation. Other points to note, the seismic attribute only defines porosity. It is not a direct hydrocarbon indicator. And from there, we're using the cross sections in the logs to show that when wellbores are not drilled into these porosity enhancements, there is no porosity present on open hole logs, and that there is reservoir compartmentalization between the reservoirs as evidenced by initial shut-in pressure from various wellbores within the greater field. So moving on to the next section, as we reference cross-section X to X prime encompassing the Catherine 3323 wellbore, the Wurtzfeld 2-23 wellbore, and the Plinus 24-24 wellbore. Correlations have been made such from the Stony Mountain through the Red River D base formation tops. From there, relevant information in boxes, items to point out, relative completion dates versus initial shut-in pressures between wellbores. What we see here is about 5 months of completion difference between the Catherine 3323 and Plinus 2424 wellbore, in that reservoir pressure, initial shut-in reservoir pressure, was over 500 psi higher, strongly indicating that there is no reservoir continuity between them. In addition, the Wurtzfeld 22-23 wellbore shows zero porosity development as it was drilled outside of one of these porosity-enhanced dolomite units. And then moving down, just a second set of wellbores to exhibit the same information is shown in cross-section Z to Z prime, again indicating the same set of parameters discussed in cross-section X to X prime, but I won't, unless asked upon, repeat the exact same technical information a second time.
Sure. Move on then to the next page where you've got the Z to Z prime cross section.
Yes, sir. So again, showing the same relative technical basis for reservoir compartmentalization and porosity enhancement only due to the seismic derived attribute. We see two wellbores with over 2 years of completion differences in terms of completion date. Initial shut-in pressure is identical. The Mouse 2322 would have had 2 years of production, showing that, again, initial shut-in pressures are indicative of a reservoir compartmentalization. And then lastly, again, in the Kautzman 1 well, we see no evidence of porosity enhancement in the Red River D stratigraphic interval, further giving support to that there is no porosity development when there is not dolotomization identified.
Let's go ahead then and move on to exhibit number 10. If you can just kind of walk us through that mud log and then also explain, what you're attempting to show with this exhibit.
Yes, sir. So, looking at Exhibit 10, there has been a snippet of the toe of the Wurtzfeld wellbore as taken in a mud log by Whiting Oil and Gas Corporation. Points to make reference to here is the incidence of fluorescence at the toe of the wellbore. I apologize, the cross-section, the text is a little grainy on the printouts. However, there is notations of fluorescence and pinpoint streaming cut, which is geologic evidence for hydrocarbons to be present at the toe of the well.
Okay.
As referenced as to the measured depth shown on the depth track within the mud log.
Okay. Yeah, let's move on to exhibit number 11, if you can take us through that Wurtzfeld geosteering.
Yes, sir. So, review of Exhibit 11, the efforts here were to confirm that the Wurtzfeld wellbore was indeed drilled within the Red River D stratigraphic unit. Obviously, geosteering software was implemented here. The wellbore was landed with gamma ray to show stratigraphic changes. The interpretation indicates that the wellbore was indeed landed in the Red River D, and then subsequent horizontal LWD logs were run and used to steer the well to, again, further evidence that the entire lateral was indeed drilled in the Red River D stratigraphic interval. From there, tying back to both Exhibit 10 and to Exhibit, give me 1 second here, Exhibit 6, evidence of pinpoint streaming cut, fluorescence, and hydrocarbon indicators at the toe of the lateral, coupled with the highest structural position of the lateral in a subsea TVD sense is at the toe of the lateral. That was the basis for defining the original oil-water contact. Again, will be referenced to Exhibit 12 here as we review that exhibit.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and let's move on to exhibit number 12 then.
Yes, sir. So then, looking at and continuing to attempt to define the original oil-water contact within the unit, looking at Exhibit 12, we have pulled what production data exists for the Wurtzfeld during its initial completion. What we see is a 34-day production profile in which the wellbore produced, on average, 13 barrels of oil a month and anywhere from 4,600 barrels to 15,000 barrels of water during its test. From there, knowing that there has been a very, very high water cut present, and then utilizing the exhibits as described prior, we have made an effort in our best efforts to define the original oil-water contact as shown in the prior exhibits, knowing that there was a small amount of oil production produced during the Wurtzfeld's initial test.
Okay. And then, Stephen, exhibit number 13, you've kind of got a narrative. I don't want you to read that verbatim, but if you can just highlight for us what you've laid out there, and if there's anything in addition to what you've already explained, why the geology kind of justifies the
Yes, sir.
creation of this unit.
Yes, sir. So, in referral to Exhibit 13, what we made our best efforts to do is to map reservoir extent utilizing seismic, which has been discussed already, and then to calculate an original oil in place and a primary recovery to date estimated from volumetric calculations. Within the unit, we used the best information we had available, which was log parameters from the Plinus 24-24 wellbore. From there, we calculated oil in place utilizing the calculated net pay, porosity, and a petrophysically defined formation volumetric factor to calculate an initial oil in place, We then looked at using relative recovery factors, what its estimated primary recovery was, then compared to primary EUR based upon type curves, and found a very close match. From there, I believe that covers everything within Exhibit 13. Yes, it does.
And Mr. Examiner, that's all the questions that I currently have for Mr. Zagorski, and I would offer Exhibits 5 through 13.
Any objection?
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Or any objections? I guess.
Oh, I'm sorry, no objections.
The exhibits 5 through 13 are admitted, and then cross-examination, Mr. Bender.
Thank you. I'm sorry, if Zanerski, is that how you?
Zagorski, sir.
Zagorski, okay, thank you, I apologize.
No worries, thank you.
So let's start with Exhibit 6. I want to make sure I understand. Exhibit 6 was basically prepared by you with certain assumptions, and one of the assumptions was that the pay thickness was it 35 feet across this area?
To be
Or 30.
exact, it should be, I believe it is 34.
34 feet?
34 feet, sir.
Okay. And the oil-water contact was basically picked as a result of your horizontal well, the Wurtzfeld well, is that correct?
That is correct, sir, yes.
And I don't think you have it on this exhibit, but I think an engineering exhibit shows that there are basically 26 acres of productive reservoir in 24, is that correct?
To my best knowledge, yes.
And 194 acres of productive reservoir in tract, I said section 24, but I meant to say tract 1. Is that right?
Yes, sir. to my
Okay,
best
and
knowledge.
then approximately 194 acres in tract 2.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and of course, those are, once again, they're based on assumptions of 34 feet of pay, constant porosity, is that correct?
That is correct.
Permeability as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Everything was assumed to be constant based upon the information we had available to us.
Okay. And I believe you said that your production on the Wurtzfeld well in a 30-some day period, apologize, my notes are kind of scattered throughout here, but like 34, 35-day period was 13 barrels of oil, 34-day period was 13 barrels of oil, is that correct?
It is 25 barrels of oil over a 34-day test.
Okay, I thought I heard you say 13, but, and then the water was between 4,600 and 16,000?
Yes, sir. On a monthly basis, when it is cumulative, it is a little over 19,000 barrels cumulative.
All right, thank you. So isn't that in itself an indication that the reservoir, in terms of perhaps even thickness, but certainly permeability and porosity, is not constant across that area as you have it depicted on Exhibit 6?
We have no evidence to suggest that it is ununiform, and we have no evidence to suggest that it is not fully uniform.
Okay. Well, let's go to your Exhibit 9.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and the second page of Exhibit 9 shows that you have no porosity development in the Wurtzfeld, at least where you logged that well, is that correct?
Are we referring to, just confirming, we are referring to cross-section XX prime, correct?
Yes, thank you.
So, yes, that is not a well bore that Foundation Energy Management operates. It is just a publicly available well log, and from subsurface interpretation, we see no development of porosity within the Red River D.
But you do have porosity in the Catherine well, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you do have porosity in the Polinas well,
That is correct.
which would indicate that you do have varying porosity and permeability over short distances, is that correct?
Short, yes, in terms of short distances.
Okay, so there is a possibility that you could have varying, I know you said there was no indication of this, but there is a possibility that you could have varying porosity and permeability in tract 1 versus tract 2. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Let's now go to your, once again, Exhibit 9, but the first page of Exhibit 9, which I think you have labeled as cross-sections.
Yes, sir.
See that? There's a number of fields on here. The the lettering's real small. You got younger eyes than I do, so maybe you can read it. But are any of these other fields in this area unitized?
At this time, they are not.
Okay, what is the closest Red River D pool that is unitized?
Offhand, I do not know.
Okay, is there one in Golden Valley?
To my best knowledge, there is.
There is, but you can't tell me what field it is.
If, again, to my best knowledge, it would, I guess, be the beach water flood.
Okay. And how big of a unit is that, do you know?
I do not know offhand, sir.
Is it fair to say that Red River D development is, and if you don't understand this term, just let me know, but is sort of developed in a lenticular nature?
I'm not sure that would be the best description.
Do you have like thickening in the middle of the reservoir and then thinning as you go to the edges?
From the well data we have available to us, on average, we have not seen that, no.
All right. So the evidence you're saying that you've seen shows that you have continuity with respect to thickness, porosity, and permeability.
Within available information, it's all within a, for lack of better terms, a close order of magnitude.
And what field demonstrates that?
If subsequent open hole logs from any of the on-strike fields show, similar thickness and porosity within, I don't want to say a standard deviation, I'm not a statistician, but within a few percentage points.
And what's similar thickness? Is similar thicknesses 20 feet and 30 feet, or is similar thicknesses 10 feet and 30 feet?
I would say within 10% of what we've seen, 10 to 15% of what we've seen in the Plinus 2424 well.
But it could vary, obviously, from
There is,
field to
yes,
field.
there is absolutely variation at times.
Let's go to your Exhibit 11. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand your testimony to suggest that the red line, as you have it marked on the lateral of the Wurtzfeld, is the first evidence that you showed of porosity in the area. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that is, for clarification, overlap of the geosteering interpretation with the seismic interpretation.
Okay. And that porosity is in the Red River D?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then the inclination of the well bore tends to go up, and is it still in the Red River D as you go up?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so all the area between the red line and the end of the well bore is in the Red River D?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And, given the fact that you did produce 16,000 barrels of water and 26 barrels of oil, or I thought it was 13, but you said 26, in your opinion, is that giving up a lot of fluid for this reservoir?
Yes,
Okay. Why do you say why is your answer yes?
because of the gross water production over the initial production test.
Let's go back then again to your Exhibit 6. Tract 1, I think your land witness indicated is comprised of 480 surface acres, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And Tract 2 is comprised of 320 acres, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So even though you have only 26 acres of productive reservoir depicted on your Exhibit 6, you're proposing that it be given a weight of 60% of that particular parameter, is that correct?
Can you
Well,
refine that question,
sure.
please?
Is 480 over 800 60%?
Yes, sir.
And is 320 over 800 40%?
Yes, sir.
So even though you only have 26 acres of productive reservoir and 24, you're giving, in terms of weight to that tract, 60%, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't know if you're the witness to answer this question. If not, have another one to pass on to Tyler. But what if this doesn't work? What are the plans? I mean, you're going to be, you're suggesting spending quite a bit of money to recomplete the Wurtzfeld well. And if it's unsuccessful, what happens next?
I may have to defer to Mr. Stalkup on that.
Would you agree with me that if it's unsuccessful, that the owners in Tract 2 will have shared revenue and proceeds of production with Tract 1, and Tract 1 really wouldn't have contributed anything?
Yes.
Okay. No further questions.
Are there any questions from commission staff?
Steven, bear with me, I'm gonna bounce around again here too.
No
Notes
worries.
are all over the place, but, let's start with, actually, in the unit agreement, Article, 1.14. Sorry, 119, I can read my own writing. Article 1.19, the unitized formation. It's on page 3.
You said 1.9, sir?
1.19, it's on page 3. The
Yes.
bottom of page 3. Here you're identifying the reservoir as the common pool, shall mean the Red River D formation, which is the stratigraphic interval, and then you identify what you identify as the Red River D on the type log. I want to point out that we have a Red River formation. We don't have a Red River D formation. I think this should be revised to state Red River D interval within the Red River D, within the Red River formation. And as a counterpart to that request, I'm going to ask for a revised version of Exhibit 7. The open hole logs that you identify as Exhibit 7 here, effectively the type log for the unit.
Yes, sir.
It looks like you have the top of your D and the bottom of your D identified here. Is that strictly limited to the D porosity?
Yes.
Okay.
And just to clarify, to the best of my abilities, the Red River D is the zone of porosity. It just happens to be the overlap. So when the Red River D is dolomitized, it becomes the porosity of the Red River Formation in this geographic area.
Right. The Red River A through D zones or intervals are typically porosity identified intervals, correct?
They are identified by cyclical eustatic changes that were driven by paleodeposition.
Okay. Would you be able to provide a copy of Exhibit 7 that would identify the boundaries of not just the Red River D here, but the Red River A, B, C, and D on one exhibit?
Yes, sir.
Okay, please do so. While I'm on this, Exhibit 7 and Exhibit 8, both the Plenus wells and the Wurtzfeld wells were deviated wellbores, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The log here, is it corrected to TVD, or is it purely a measured depth? So on, specifically Exhibit 7, is it purely a measured depth representation?
I do not remember. I can follow up on that, though.
Okay. I'd like that confirmed when you revise the exhibit.
Yes, sir.
And then, I guess, the same, maybe provide Exhibit 8 with the same treatment,
Yes, sir.
and confirm whether that's a measured depth representation, or if it's been converted to a TVD presentation. Jumping over to Exhibit 5. So when you identified this exhibit, and it's here that the boundary that you have for the porosity development was identified via seismic amplitude anomaly.
Correct.
In previous cases where we've had seismic amplitude anomaly identify zones and pods like this for targeting, we've been provided heat maps of that zone. Is that
Understood.
something you can provide in this case for this pod?
I believe so,
Okay.
to my best knowledge.
With respect to that anomaly mapping that's done, because that's what you use to define your boundary, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. You've said that what's identified in that process is the existence of porosity.
Yes, sir.
Is there any component of the quality or quantity of that porosity that's identifiable in that seismic anomaly mapping?
From my experience, there is not. It is either just incidence of porosity development or incidence of zero porosity development.
Do you recall how the heat mapping concept was done on those anomaly maps then?
Not offhand, but it is an item I can follow up with.
Okay. I think I would like a supplement that at least details some of that, how the seismic anomaly mapping is done, what you're looking at and how that's heat mapped, and then what the parameter you use to cut off that pod.
Understood.
So basically, how you got your outline on Exhibit 5.
Yes, sir.
Jumping over to Exhibit 6, the comment you have at the bottom of Exhibit 6, economic limit of the amplitude anomaly. Do you want to expand on that comment?
Yes, sir. I will, to my best knowledge, the description of economic limit of amplitude anomaly was to be said in parallel with porosity development. And also, knowing that this is a productive unit, obviously, then that porosity development is indicative of pay. So because the edge of the anomaly is the edge of our porosity, it's the edge of our pay.
Okay, so essentially, this boundary is still the edge of what you've defined as the porosity present.
Yes, sir.
Okay. When you discussed exhibits 9, 10, 11, there was a fair amount of discussion on how you determined where the oil-water contact was in the Wurtzfield well, correct?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to get into those specific exhibits a little bit in a minute, but with respect to Exhibit 6 and the orientation you have drawn of an oil-water contact on this exhibit, you effectively identified a point in the Wurtzfield well where you believed you crossed the boundary,
That is correct.
okay? And that is where your blue line here, your oil-water contact, crosses the Wurtzfield well?
That is correct.
Okay. How did you define the rest of the orientation of that line? How did you determine it was on this northwest, southeast trend?
Making our best efforts at maintaining that the oil-water contact remains on strike at that subsea TVD depth. Since there's obviously a structural component to this reservoir, that obviously if there's an initial oil-water contact at any given subsea depth, that obviously it should, in any normal circumstance, continue on in an on-strike orientation.
Okay. When you say on strike, are you referring to on strike within the Red River D?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So then, jumping back to Exhibit 5, this is a structure map on the top of the Red River.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you provide the same structure map on top of the Red River D?
I will make my best efforts. I know that at that level of granularity, seismic data becomes constrained, so I'm concerned about its accuracy and efficacy, but I will do my best efforts.
Okay. I mean, to that point, if we're not confident in that structure and that strike that's identify the strike at least on that Exhibit D and provide some narrative for why we're still confident on the orientation of this oil water contact as depicted on Exhibit 6.
Understood. If you don't mind me adding a supplement, one comment that I made that is probably needs to be revised is that the comments regarding relative strike and dip should not have said to just the Red River D, but to the greater strata or sedimentary stack of sediments that exist in the Williston Basin. All are exhibiting dip in the southwest northeast orientation.
So with that, then, provide, at least with respect to the Red River, provide what you what you're providing as the strike and dip of the Red River here. Provide an exhibit that depicts that and how you determined it.
Yes, sir.
Again, with the whole point being, I need to have some validation or something to verify that the orientation of this oil water contact as depicted here in the exhibit is reasonable.
Yes, sir.
Specifically now, to continue on the identification of the oil water contact, when you discussed exhibit 10, the mud log exhibit, you indicated that the mud logs were identifying fluorescence, evidence that there's hydrocarbon fluorescence in
Yes, sir.
the cuttings.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is there anywhere else in that mud log that hydrocarbon fluorescence was identified in the cuttings?
Not to my recollection, but it's something I can follow up on and provide a supplement of the entire log if necessary.
I believe we have the logs in file. In fact, I should have opened with this, but is there any objection to the commission taking administrative notice of all the logs and wells, all the logs on the wells in this case, in this unit area?
There's no objection.
I would like, I believe I would like an exhibit, or maybe an amendment of Exhibit 10, or even some narrative on Exhibit 10 that indicates whether or not you had any other fluorescence identified throughout the wellbore. Exhibit 11, here it was asked or identified that the, so both on Exhibit 5 and Exhibit 11, you have this red line that identifies the first instance of enhanced porosity, okay? And I think during testimony, you indicated that that was where the wellbore crossed over into your seismic anomaly mapping,
That is correct, sir, yes.
okay? This Wurtzfeld well does have horizontal resistivity and porosity logs, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Is that enhanced porosity also indicated as you cross this same point on those horizontal logs?
I believe so, but that is something I do need to review.
Okay. I'm going to ask for another supplement then. Call it a version of something like your Exhibit 10 Exhibit 11 or 12, where you identify what that signature looks like as you're crossing into enhanced porosity from outside the pod to inside the pod,
Understood.
and where that happens along the log or along the wellbore. On your Exhibit 13, and during some of you identified some of the parameters that were used to calculate the oil in place, correct?
Yes, sir.
is it a correct statement that the oil in place as calculated for, so phase 2 of the formula includes remaining recoverable oil in place, correct?
To my best knowledge, yes.
Okay, and so the oil in place in that parameter was calculated using a flat porosity, water saturation, thickness,
Yes,
P sub O. So all those are
Correct.
flat parameters.
yes,
Okay, and those are the parameters as identified, I think, later on exhibit, oh shoot, 20-something, in the economics. 29 maybe, 20,
26?
26, if that's the right one.
correct, sir.
Exhibit 26, okay. And so those are the parameters identified in that exhibit also?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So effectively, the only thing that is moving your oil in place number around between the two tracks would be the number of acres within each tract that have been attributed to the tract?
Yes, sir, correct.
And that is entirely based on the boundary of your porosity pod and where the oil-water contact was drawn?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think I'm going to ask for another piece of information to be included in that exhibit on the horizontal logs as analyzed.
Okay,
If your horizontal logs are indicating variable porosity as you drill through the porous portion of this pod, I want you to provide some narrative for why use a flat porosity instead of the information from that log.
understood.
And this is probably a question for the engineer, but I'm just gonna pose it. So your portion of that would have been, so your portion of the phase 2 calculation would have been determining the oil in place and the parameters that went into the oil in place, correct?
Yes,
Okay, the rest of that, that parameter, the remaining recoverable, would have been engineering determined?
yes.
Okay, I'll ask questions of that with the next witness then. I think that's everything I have on geology for now. Thank you.
Are there any further questions from commission staff? Seeing none? Any redirect, Mr. Mann?
No, Mr. Examiner, thank you.
Mr. Examiner, I may have a question or two, if I could.
Let's
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Sir, let's turn to your Exhibit 6. Your calculation of the oil-water contact that is depicted on this exhibit, is that a calculation that was done at the time the Wurtzfeld well was drilled?
That is correct.
Okay. And that was what, maybe 2012, 2011?
I believe it was 2013. There was a reference to exhibits of what year they were drilled further in this.
So, since that time, the Polinas has produced several 100,000 barrels of oil, is that correct?
That is correct.
Is it safe to say then that that oil-water contact has likely moved to the southwest as a result of that production out of the Polinas?
In regards to primary recovery, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, the time is 10:24 a.m. Why don't we take a 10-minute break here and then we'll move on to your next witness. We'll return at 10:35.
I thought his last name was Nagurski. I was gonna ask if you were related to Bronco Nagurski.
You wouldn't be the first. I wish, that'd be pretty cool, but.
Is he still alive? I think he still is, isn't he? He has some North Dakota connection. I don't know what it is. But,
We are back on the record. The time is 10:38 a.m. Mr. Mann, we can move on to your next witness.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Examiner. It'll be Tyler Stallcup.
All right, Mr. Skullclip, please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief.
I do.
Tyler, can I have you give us your name and spell it for the record?
Yes. My name is Tyler Stallcup, spelled Tyler. Last name Stallcup, Stalcup.
And Tyler, what's your business address?
My business address is 5057 Keller Springs Road, Suite 650, Addison, Texas, zip code 75001.
And Tyler, who do you work for?
I work for Foundation Energy Management, LLC.
And what's your position with Foundation?
I'm an operations engineer.
Okay. Have you previously testified before this commission on engineering-related matters?
I have.
And when you have you had your qualifications received as that of an expert?
I did.
Okay. And are you familiar with the unit and the engineering matters associated with the unit, including like the allocation formula?
I am.
Okay. And were you involved in preparation of the petition for the unitization?
I was.
Okay. I'd move the testimony, Mr. Stallcup, be received as that of an expert in this case.
No objection.
Testimony will be received as that of an expert.
And Tyler, let's go ahead and go through the exhibits. We left off after Lee and Stephen on exhibit number 14, and if you can just briefly kind of identify that exhibit.
Certainly. So here in Exhibit 14, you can see the proposed Camel Hump Red River unit is shaded in that light blue color. And then you can also see the tracks identified, track 1, which is currently the Wartsfield unit, and track 2, which is currently the Plinus unit, numbered in red.
Okay. And then Tyler, moving on to exhibit number 15, I don't want you to go through all the names, but does that exhibit have a breakdown of the owners and their particular interests in each tract and the phases?
It does, yes.
Okay. And also with respect to the tracks and the allocation formulas, that's set forth in Article 5 of the Unit Agreement, Exhibit number 29, correct?
Yes, it is.
And there's been some discussion on that already in the Exhibit C. Can you maybe just explain, how that allocation, how you came up with that allocation factor or allocation formula, how those were determined and derived?
Certainly. So to come up with our allocation formula, which as has been mentioned previously, for Phase 1, it's based on 10% usable well bores and 90% current production. We arrived at that by reviewing various other offset Red River water floods in the state of North Dakota. Not to get ahead of myself, but some of them are listed at the end of the technical exhibits. The reason that we decided to use 10% for usable well bores is because both are going to be important to the short-term recovery within Phase 1. The Plinus is obviously critical because it's the producing well that's currently active, but then the Wartsfield will also be useful to us because as we begin to inject water there, since our reservoir is above the bubble point pressure of the said oil that's in our reservoir, we expect it to act like a piston. And as more water is injected into the Wartsfield, we expect to see that that pressure come out in the Plinus in the form of oil, accelerating the time frame that it'll be recover the reserves, therefore increasing the value of that well during Phase 1. So that's why we went ahead and allocated some to there, and then also 90% to current production. I know there was a question too about why we didn't do remaining primary recovery. We just wanted to simplify it. I saw that in a lot of other documentation where it was 30% or 60% remaining primary reserves and current production. Since there's only 2 wells and one is actively producing and the other's uneconomic to produce, I just combined that and simplified it just for clarity's sake there.
Sure.
And then going to Phase 2, as it was mentioned, then we switched to 10% allocation for surface acreage and 90% allocation for the remaining recoverable oil in place. We chose the 10% surface acreage because, as it's been discussed previously in this hearing, there's a lot of, it's not exactly clear exactly what the reservoir boundary is, exactly what the thicknesses are. It's the nature of our business. We can't see down there. So we use our best judgment from an engineering and a geological standpoint. But from the surface acreage, we can be very certain of that with a higher degree of certainty than we can the actual reservoir extent. So that's why we chose to use 10% of surface acreage for the unitization, and then 90% to the remaining recoverable oil in place. And as Stephen mentioned earlier, I think Exhibit 13, he kind of went through how we got original oil in place and established that. And then to get to recoverable oil in place, we applied our 14% recovery factor to that acreage, as was also mentioned. It's expected that oil water contact as the Plinus has been produced has migrated. So to account for that, we basically went through from a volumetric standpoint to match to our reserve and decline curve calculations to remove those barrels from the reservoir and estimate in a snapshot approximately when this was written where that current oil water contact is, and then extrapolated recoverable remaining reserves from there.
Okay. So Tyler, taking, all those factors into account that you've just described, is the allocation formula that you've got presented in the unit agreement at Article 5 and then here in Exhibit 15, in your opinion, is that going to protect the correlative rights of all the owners within the unit boundary, both Tract 1 and Tract 2?
I believe it will, yes.
Okay. Let's move on to exhibit number 16. Can you describe that exhibit for us?
Certainly. So Exhibit 16, it's a quick development history and a summary of the completion of both the Wartsfield and the Plinus. So it outlines when the wells were drilled, both in 2013, their current status, why the Wartsfield isn't currently being produced, and why the Red River is, and their locations. And then it also notes that they're both completed in the Red River D.
Then let's move on to the production plot on exhibit number 17.
Certainly. So as has been mentioned previously, this is a summary plot of the Wartsfield. It produced for portions of 2 months, producing just under 20,000 barrels of water and 34 MCF of gas and 25-ish barrels of oil were recovered from the Wartsfield during its initial production test. It was deemed at the time to be uneconomic to produce such a high water cut well. And then to note too, this was a fairly short period of time. The well was only active for a few days with an ESP in place and produced in excess of 1,000 barrels of water per day, indicating good amounts of permeability along the wellbore.
Okay. Let's move on to the production plot for the Plinus well at exhibit 18.
Certainly. So attached is the production plot along with our current estimated decline curve at the time of doing year-end reserves for the year of 2022. And that's why you can see the estimated EUR and the oil remaining. And at the close of 2022, that was run off that SEC price deck. So that's why you'll see a little bit of a discrepancy between the EUR that we have in the rest of the exhibits and what was listed there. This well has had fantastically very low decline, which is great. And so as you increase that price of oil, you can produce the well for a lot longer. And we ran with a more conservative price deck for our economics when putting the unit agreement together.
Then let's move on to exhibit number 19. If you can describe that pressure data plot and what that's kind of showing us.
Certainly. So this data plot is actually from reservoir pressure that was measured in the Wartsfield. So you can see the initial reservoir pressure from 2013. The blue line is the estimated values throughout time. And then points 1 through 4 are from bottom hole pressure surveys that after we drilled out the cement plug that was isolating the Wartsfield to keep it in temporary abandonment status. Annually, we ran a bottom hole pressure survey to monitor the reservoir pressure. Over the years since we've done that, we've done the pressure surveys, and as the Plinus has continued to produce more and more fluids, we've seen a corresponding decline in the reservoir pressure at the Wartsfield, and it has very closely correlated to the projected decline of pressure that was built in our model using the estimated extent of the reservoir that Stephen has mentioned previously, and that adds to our confidence in that modeling and that these are connected.
Let's move on then to the wellbore diagram for the Wurtzfeld. That's exhibit number 20.
Certainly. So this is a simple diagram showing how the Warts Field currently sits. We had it when we drilled out the plug back in 2018, 2019, thereabout. We set it up to be ready to be injected into with the packer at the bottom of the hole. And we've been conducting our surveys through there.
Okay. And then moving on to the Plinus wellbore diagram, exhibit 21.
Certainly. So this is a diagram depicting how the Plinus is currently assembled. It's set up as a producing well from the Red River D, and it's being artificially lifted using rod lift. And it's detailed here.
Okay. And then let's move on to exhibit number 22, if you can take us through that table and kind of how that plays into the allocation.
Certainly.
formula.
So for Exhibit 22, you can see the surface acreage for each track. So track 1 of the Wartsfield, track 2 of the Plinus. And then the allocation of reserves acreage, that's for primary reserves. Since the Wartsfield is uneconomic, it has none. And then the Plinus at 313 that's listed, that's showing with the mapping that was done from seismic data to come up with that. And so we've allocated, based on that, 113 of 113 acres is 100%. And then we multiplied that by the remaining primary recovery based on both volumetric and decline curve analysis of 336,000 barrels of oil.
And then let's move on to the secondary recovery data that you've got on exhibit 23.
Certainly. So as you can see here, again, it's the tract 1 of the Wartsfield and tract 2 of the Plinus. The total acreage is listed as 480 and 320. And then the allocation of reserves, so that's the acreage with our current oil water contact mapped on top of our seismic interpretation that we also have backed up from the horizontal and the logs from the Wartsfield. And so then we simply summed those, divided 26 by the sum of reserve acreage and 194 by the sum of the reserve acreage to get 11.8% and 88.19% for the secondary recovery. And then we use our recovery factor that I'll cover in a later exhibit of 0.56 to be our secondary recovery over primary recovery. We multiply that by our estimated primary recovery for the Plinus to get the sum of barrels there, and then allocated that according to the percentages.
Okay. Then let's move on to exhibit number 24. Can you take us through what we're looking at for capital for the project?
Certainly. So this is the original capital requirements. The cost to unitize originally was anticipated to be $50,000, as will be seen in a another document that's coming up, another exhibit that's gone up a little bit. And then we also have included here the cost to build the injection battery at the Wartsfield of $313,000. So putting in the tanks, putting in the injection pumps, and all the associated equipment to keep that warm and within compliance.
Sure. And then I think exhibit number 25 ties into that a little bit. Can you
Yes.
take us through that?
So Exhibit 25, you can see a proposed flow line that's just under 2 miles in length. We have a T-aid well called the Loman that is just to the west of the Wartsfield. We plan to convert that well into a Dakota source water well. So we'll lift that by ESP or another artificial lift, and we'll install a flow line so that way we can transfer water from the Loman to the Wartsfield to be used as supply water for the water flood at the most economically as possible. One note on this is we do not plan on installing this flow line day one to minimize our capital cost to the whole unit and our partnerships. We plan to truck in water from the offsetting Red River wells. Those trucks currently drive right past the Wartsfield on the way to our SWD, so there'll be no cost to the Wartsfield incremental for that, or the unit rather, for that. And then that way, once we confirm that the project has worked, then we'll go ahead and we'll add in those additional capital costs that'll be seen on the next exhibit.
Yeah, so let's move to exhibit number 6, and if I could have you walk through what the economics would look like for the secondary recovery unit if it's approved.
Certainly. So as mentioned previously, the total extent of the reservoir is 220 acres with an average of 13% porosity and 80% oil saturation with an initial oil formation volume factor of 1.29. Using those metrics, you can calculate an original oil in place of just over 4.6 million barrels. At the time of writing this, we had produced 332,000 barrels for a recovery factor of 7.1. We estimate that we're approximately, or just under, or over halfway producing that and have 323,000 barrels remaining to produce, which would give us a estimated total primary recovery of 655,000 barrels, or 14% of the original oil in place. And then, as you can see, we did a economic run at a flat 60. The S over P ratio that we're expecting based on offset water floods is listed in the middle at 5.6. So we anticipate recovering an additional 366,800 barrels of oil for a secondary recovery factor of the original oil in place of 7.8%, with a PV10 value of just under $3 million, which exceeds our total estimated cost of $814,000 to fully develop this field. That includes both the short-term work of unitization, previous work of converting the well to be set up as an injector, and then the work that we're doing in the short term of installing the injection facilities, and then more long-term work of converting the Loman to be a source water well and installing the flow line. That's why you see the discrepancy of the 814 for the overall economics, and then the initial capital requirements are a little bit lower than that.
So, okay. So considering that the capital requirements, all the economic data that you've just summarized, in your opinion, would the value of the additional oil and gas that you'll recover from the secondary recovery unit, would that exceed any additional costs that may be associated with conducting the operation?
It will. And for clarity, gas is not sold at this location, so it'll just be the value of the oil recovered.
Okay. But still, your
But
opinion
yes,
is the
and
same.
it is, yes.
Yeah.
Just to be,
So, and along those same lines then, would it be your opinion that creation and development of the unit be for the common good then of all of the owners within the unit?
it would be, yes.
Okay. And would that then result in the general advantage of the owners of the oil and gas rights within the common source of supply here?
I believe it would, yes.
Okay. Let's move on then to next exhibit. Exhibit number 27. Take us through that exhibit.
Certainly. So in Exhibit 27, you can see the previous production from the Plinus 24-24, its decline curve. So you can see that extrapolated for primary recovery is the solid green line, and then the uniform dashed line is the total expected production, including the secondary recovery. So as you can see, we're expecting to very quickly have a significant bump in production as a result of beginning the water flood. And then the hybrid dashed and dotted line is the cumulative incremental production from the water flood. Cumulative expected production.
Sure. So Tyler, in your opinion then, would the proposed unit and operations substantially increase the ultimate recovery of oil and gas from the common source of supply?
I believe it would, yes.
Okay. And would that then prevent waste?
It would, yes.
Let's move on to exhibit number 28. I think there was maybe some questions earlier about similar units. If you kind of touch on that and take us through this exhibit 28.
Certainly. So each of the stars that are represented on this map, with the exception of the blue star in Golden Valley County, that one identifies this proposed Camel Hump Red River unit, and all of the other stars are the offset water floods that we've used in our analysis to choose the expected secondary over primary recovery ratio of 0.56. The majority of them were to the south, and then the red star that's also in Golden Valley County is a water flood that we operated. So that was the closest one. After doing that water flood, we came across some more petrophysical information that Stephen, if needed, can describe in more detail of why that water flood didn't work. The actual reservoirs were not connected despite their close kind of distance to each other. But we have a lot of data and evidence to show that we believe that the Camel Hump reservoirs are connected. And when we looked back on the data from that beach water flood, there were clear differences and reasons why we missed that one. But now we know from that we believe that the Camel Hump water flood will work. So those are the offset reservoirs we have there.
So the results of the beach aren't indicative of what you're
No,
anticipating?
we don't believe it'll be similar at all.
I have no further questions for Mr. Stallcup at this time. I'd offer the engineering exhibits, I think it was 14 through 28.
All right. Any objection?
No objection.
The exhibits are admitted. Did you offer, I can't remember if we got 29 and 30 already?
Yeah, initially with Mr. Garvey, we did.
Mr. Bender, any?
Yeah, just a couple questions to Mr. Stallcup. Let's maybe start where we left off, to the exhibit 28. You said the beach unit is a unit that is operated by your company, is that correct?
That's correct.
When was that unit formed?
I believe it was in 2017.
Okay. And is it still in existence?
It is, yes, to the best of my knowledge.
You said it didn't work, right?
Correct.
Okay. Are you going to move to terminate it?
So yes, I believe the unit has been. That's a better question for Lee, to be honest. It's been shifted a little bit in exactly how we're operating it. The production well is still in operation. I think there was much more similar ownership in the two as well.
So you don't know if you're going to terminate it?
It would be a better question for land.
Does your company operate any other units besides the beach unit in North Dakota?
I believe the fields of Plaza and Wabeck are unitized that we operate in the state of North Dakota.
Those aren't,
They're not Red River units, no.
is the beach unit, is the formation that's, or not the formation, but the porosity stringer that's unitized, is it Red River D?
It is.
Okay. Let's go to the second page of this exhibit. I believe it's still part of Exhibit 28. All the other units are either in southwestern North Dakota or in South Dakota, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What, maybe 150, 200 miles away?
That seems reasonable.
Okay. Let's go to, Exhibit 24. You talked about the capital costs, and you talked about the, well, you 50,000, is it $50,000 or is it 75? Because my exhibit says $50,000, but it was 75, but your testimony seemed to have reversed it, so.
Yes, so originally, Lee can better answer this question. It was originally estimated to be 50,000 due to the time that it's taken to get the unitization to this point. I think we're going to be closer in the neighborhood of 200,000 for the unitization process.
Does that include where you got unitization at 50,000 and build injection battery and works filled for 313? If you add that, that's more than 200,000.
So it would be, for the unitization, at the point of writing this, it was estimated to be 50,000. Due to the time it's taken to get to this point, those costs have gone up. It would still be within the economics of the 800 it was run at. And then the 313,000 is separate from the unitization cost. So that would be the cost required to begin injecting into the Wurtzfield well upon approval of the unitization and the UIC permit.
And it's to include the building the battery and that sort of thing, is that
Correct.
right?
Yep.
What all goes into the unitization costs, the 50 that was estimated and now the 200?
That would be a question that Lee could answer better for land. They keep track of that.
What do you know about it?
I know it's various legal fees, permitting fees, and fees of that nature. The fees required to assemble the documents, have third party review them, mail them out to various working interests and mineral owners.
When was the estimate of $50,000 done?
It was done in July of 2022.
And from July of '22 to, let's just say, March or February of 2023, it went up $150,000?
I think Lee would be able to better answer that, but that's my understanding.
Okay. And on your Exhibit 25, you talked about a pipeline potentially being added at a later date, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, do you have an estimate of that cost?
It'd be about approximately $115,000 to install the pipeline.
And I think your testimony was is that you're going to wait to see if the unit works before you expend that money, is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's go to your Exhibit 26. I have some questions on that. The second bold point there is current conditions and calculations within the reservoir. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And then if you go down, the next bold is estimated secondary water flood. The next one is reservoir parameters. And then we have, again, current conditions and calculated within the reservoir. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, so on the top current conditions, you have oil cumulative production, 332,000. You see that?
I do.
And then at the bottom, you have a cum oil production at 546,000 barrels.
I do see that, yes.
Okay, so to me, that is a discrepancy. Can you explain the discrepancy?
Yes, let's see. 546 come from. So I believe that that's from, as current conditions would better be substituted for conditions at the conclusion of phase one. And so at the conclusion of phase one of primary recovery, we would then get to phase two. So I believe that that's what that would be referring to.
At the end of phase one or at the end of phase two?
At the end of phase one, beginning of phase two.
Okay, so that 546,000 would compare to when you, the number that was given earlier in terms of when you switched from phase one to phase two, is that correct?
I believe so. It's listed in Article 5 of the unit agreement. It's spelled out there.
Okay, and then, I'm sorry, say that again.
Oh, it's listed in Article 5 of the unit agreement.
Okay.
It's highlighted.
And then also under current conditions, I see original oil in place at 4.6 million barrels. And then if we go down to reservoir parameters, we have original oil in place at 4.7. That's just a rounding error.
That's just a
Not an
rounding.
error. I shouldn't call it an error, it's just rounding.
Correct,
Okay.
yes. Yep. It's hard to be precise to the tenth of a barrel in a
Sure.
reservoir of this extent. So.
I fully understand. I asked your geologist some questions about the, the reservoir and, whether it would, what it was giving up in terms of water and whether it would take water. Has your company done any injectivity tests with respect to the Wurtzville to see if it'll take water?
We're not able to, due to not having a UIC permit with the state of North Dakota, and we're not able to get the UIC permit with the state of North Dakota because we don't have the unitization yet. So we've requested it, but it's unfortunately not possible.
Is
until
there
the
anything else the
conclusion.
company could do to determine whether that well is going to take water before you spend close to $1 million to convert it and do all the other things to unitize?
So it'll be less than $1 million to going forward to inject into it. It's that $313,000 is the capital requirement. The $800,000 is for the full long-term investment, including flow lines and the conversion of another well to be the source water well. But it's our belief that it will take water is based upon the initial production, and there's, to my knowledge, not a way to know that a well will take water when it's being injected into without going ahead and injecting water into it.
So what are the minimum costs that you're going to incur to determine whether your project is going to work?
Moving forward, it'll be $313,000.
And I think in your testimony, you spent a little time talking about the fact that you looked at other units and that surface acreage is a component in unitization parameters. Is that a fair statement of your testimony?
It is, yes.
Yeah, and was that in a phase one situation or a phase two situation?
Surface acreage is for phase two.
Phase two. And in those situations that you looked at, did you have a situation where you had such a varying spacing unit size like you have here, one spacing unit being 480 acres and the other spacing unit being 320?
Not to my recollection at the moment.
Okay. What units did you look at where you found surface acreage as one of the components?
I reviewed the fields listed on Exhibit 28, analogous water floods this morning. I do not recall seeing surface acreage as one of the components there.
That's all the questions I have.
Are there any questions from commission staff?
Tyler, I got just two of them. So you stated that you won't be putting the flow line or converting the Loman until after the project goes for a little while. What are your factors for determining if it's a success to be able to put the extra capital in or not?
If it will pay out within a year, approximately, plus or minus, to install that flow line. So if we're seeing the incremental production, we'll pay to put the flow line in, as opposed to continuing to truck from offset assets, or if it's needed due to the decline of offset assets to install a flow line.
Okay, and then I think you stated it, but for the current producing well, 100% of the gas is flared.
Correct.
Given the production will hopefully go up in your guys' eyes, would you consider doing anything to capture any of that gas, whether it be a generator to use on site or some type of flare mitigation versus 100% flaring?
It's definitely an effort that we've been undertaking across the company to find solutions to use stranded gas for a beneficial purpose. So that's an ongoing effort, and we will continue to do our best in this asset and all of our assets to reduce our flaring, to use that gas for beneficial means.
Yep, thanks.
Tyler, I think you touched on some of this, but I'm going to ask you probably to do it again in a little bit. First, I'm going to start with Exhibit 13 versus Exhibit 26.
Sure.
So the second page of Exhibit 13, there is a slight discrepancy between 13 and 26 in the porosity that was used. Exhibit 13 indicates 13.2%. Exhibit 26 reservoir parameters indicate 13%. Do you recall which numbers is the correct, which one went into the calculation?
I believe it was the 13.2. I could check my notes or Stephen could confirm better. We just simplified the numbers for the economic calculations.
Functionally, it won't change the allocation across because it's a flat number across all acres, right?
Correct.
I would just like confirmation of what was used.
Certainly.
Can you point me, if you've got an exhibit that does it nicely, but, so your tract 2 participation factor of remaining recoverable oil in place. Do you have an exhibit that walks me through how that was calculated?
Not perfectly clearly, no. The closest would be the narrative exhibit of the narrative exhibit of 13 titled Reservoir Mapping.
Okay. So, do you want to verbally walk me through that?
Certainly. So to come up with that, I believe the best exhibit to start with would be, I'll just look at, I think it's 15. Exhibit 14. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry. I was looking for Stevens amplitude map.
5 or 6.
Yeah, we'll use exhibit number 6, probably the easiest. Yeah, if we look at exhibit number 6, would be the best place to start from. So we began with the original oil in place map with the original interpreted oil-water contact. We then, using our best engineering judgment and calculations, looked at the total fluid that had been produced from both the Wartsfield and the Plinus, and to see where that would move that oil-water contact, using also our expected primary recovery factor of 14%. So then we essentially used those acre barrels that have been recovered and then shifted that current oil-water contact in the southwest direction to have a new, it's not like a perfect term for it, but extent of primary recovery, you could say, to where the kind of interpreted current oil-water contact would be, that would be recoverable by primary means. And then we put that on the map and then use those acreages were collected from that map that are listed in the exhibit that you were mentioning of 23 to get that 26 acres of reserves remaining in 194.
So the acres on Exhibit 23 of 26 acres for the Wirtsfield and 194 for the Plenus is what went into the original oil in place calculation or the original remaining recoverable?
The remaining recoverable oil in place calculation.
Okay. And that is based on a moved oil water contact, not what was depicted on Exhibit 6?
That's correct.
Okay. With that understanding, I think I'd like to know, so I'm probably gonna ask for a revision of Exhibit 23. One that includes, it might be revisions of both 6 and 23. I wanna know what acres out of each tract were included based on the original placement of that oil water contact, and where that oil water contact would have moved to get you to the acreage that you included on 23. So probably add a table to 23 and a new line to 6.
Certainly.
So if I'm understanding this right, you took that moved oil water contact and the acreage that would have been attributed to the tract, calculated the oil in place using the flat values for the rest of the parameters for an oil in place calculation, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Assuming a 14% recoverable,
14% primary recoverable. Yes.
14% primary recoverable. So that, you took that oil in place, multiplied by that 14%, and then subtracted off what had been produced to date?
Correct.
Or what had been produced to date, or what was or what would be produced during primary?
What had been produced to the date when we did the calculations.
Okay. Do you know what date that calculation was done on?
I will have to double check with you on that. I believe it was around July of 2022.
Okay. We'll want to know what that date was and what that volume was that was subtracted off. Included in one of the supplementals that's been asked for, I guess. I don't know. On Exhibit 26, you've got 2 points where the oil in place is listed. One's a value of 4.6 million and one's listed at 4.7 million.
Yes. The 4.7 million is the rounded version of the 4.6.
So it's just a rounded version.
Just rounded, yep.
But that isn't the actual number that went into your, so that 4.6, let me step up back. That 4.6 up in your current conditions calculations within the reservoir, that oil in place, that is not the number that went into calculating your remaining recoverable oil in place number, is it?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's that number minus the oil that was produced at the time of calculation.
Okay, so that number is your oil in place from that calculation.
So that 4.678 million was the calculated original oil in place before any production had taken place.
Okay, so before anything.
Before anything had happened, that was the calculated value. And then to get to the remaining recoverable oil in place, we subtracted what had already been produced and then applied our recovery factors to the swept area and then went from there.
But didn't you also, before doing, what I'm trying to get at is your remaining recoverable oil in place in phase 2. Is that calculated from your original oil in place before movement of that oil water contact? Or
It is not.
So that is calculated after the oil water contact move. Okay,
Correct.
so this number wasn't the number that was the oil in place that went into that calculation.
That is correct.
Okay. I think we need to see the Exhibit 26 revised, clarified a little bit, probably with another set of columns, that this is the oil in place before anything happened, and what the oil in place number that went into the remaining recoverable calculation was.
Certainly.
On Exhibit 27, just a general question, I think you, you indicated you would, you were anticipating a relatively quick response to the water injection.
That's correct.
Were there any stimulations or anything done on these completions, or were they just open hole Red River completions?
There was no fracture. We've done some acid jobs. The most recent one we did on the Plinus this past summer to just clean up the perforations, but no
Induced fractures.
Correct.
And then in your discussion on where you plan to source the water from, you indicated that the water would initially just be trucked from your Red River producing wells.
That is correct.
What's that total volume roughly? Do you know?
Today it's around 130 barrels a day, and then there's some more that's a little bit further away that we could bring in as well.
Okay. And then is that sufficient for what you need and what you're projecting as far as the needs of the unit?
It is. We're targeting a VRR of 1.1.
Okay. If that is sufficient, I guess, where does the possibility of the Dakota water supply come in?
The possibility of Dakota water supply comes in for down the road when the offsetting Red River wells, their production declines below the needed volume to support the production of the Plinus, or if we have the great success of the Plinus and then the quantity of fluid produced there exceeds what is produced at the offset Red River wells, then we would need to bring in the additional water from the water source well.
Okay. I think that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tyler, I'm going back to Article 5 of the unit agreement. Okay, in that Phase 1 formula, you've got 90% current production. And when you were telling us about parameters that you looked at in other secondary recovery operations, you said that you found certain ones and you used those. This is a prime example of why you want to be consistent and not just grab a number because in a parameter, because if you go back to this one, somebody's going to say, well, they use current production at 90%. I want to do that too because that's pretty simple. And it may not be fair to do it on all of them. That's why when you formulate the parameters and come up with this formula, should probably take that into consideration because things can be taken out of context all the time by using parameters in previous units because it was just simple to do it. So I just want to point that out because we would prefer not to use current production, but there's a number of things that you could put in here where you're going to get identical results because the original well produced 25 barrels of oil.
Yep.
So it may be a horse apiece, but I just want to point that out, that that's very important to be finding out why it was used, not that it was used. The remaining recoverable oil in place, that was kind of troubling to me to find it, so we're looking forward to getting that so we can break that down and understand it, or you can break it down for us. The Phase 1 to Phase 2 is in here, And it says that that happens after 584,090 barrels has been produced. That should be the number of primary oil produced by the two wells added together, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we've got 25 barrels of one well, and then you've got the remaining that came out of the Plenus well.
Yes, sir.
If I compare that number to Exhibit 18 or 26, it's a different number. Eighteen is your production plot, and on it, it shows you've got an EUR of, pretty small here, but it's 691,470, correct?
That's correct. So
And that is much greater than, over 100,000 barrels greater than what you're using for phase one to phase two in the formula.
The reason for that discrepancy is the price tag that those were run at. The one that's listed to show the production history, that's from our reserves file at the end of 2022, run on the SEC price tag at the time, which was significantly higher than the, I believe I listed $60 per barrel that we used for the economics and recovery factors of Exhibit 26. And since the decline has been so low, when you add that extra price in there, you can maintain a lower volume of production for a longer time economically. And since it's so low, that adds a lot of cumulative barrels. And that's why it's so high in Exhibit 18 compared to Exhibit 26.
So you don't believe you should be using that number in Exhibit 18?
No, not for these purposes in Exhibit 18.
Why was it even included then?
It could have been cropped out.
Because this evidently was run in early 22, right? Because that's what your production goes through.
That's correct. Or in early 20.
So do you believe that the number 584,090 barrels is correct?
I do, yes.
Exhibit 17 shows the production plot of the Wurtzfield well. Your table underneath shows the monthly gas production for the well. I think that what you've got listed there is days produced. It actually produced 52 MCF in September and 31 in October. The only reason I say that is if you've used those numbers anywhere, you need to correct that. I don't know if it's any significance, but it's wrong.
Thank you for pointing that out. Gas figures were not used in any economic analysis.
The Exhibit 22. Okay, these are the remaining primary reserves. As of what date is the primary reserves calculated?
That 336,000, it was the second half of 2022. It was either around July 15th or in December.
Is that 336,420 barrels what you used on any calculations?
No, it was the number that was used here for this exhibit is the 100% of allocated reserves. for the primary recovery of phase one.
How did you calculate, I'm going back to Exhibit 18. How did you come up with the primary recovery of oil on the Plenus well? How did you decline that out?
In terms of the exact parameters for
Right.
decline, demin, and that,
Correct.
I would have to add that to a supplemental exhibit of exactly what those factors were at the time.
Did you decline it out to a certain exponential decline and then to an abandonment?
Yes, I did not add a cutoff to it besides the default 50 year. So it had a hypergolic decline to begin with, and then I had a minimum decline factor so that once it reached that, I think it was around 4%, between 4 and 5, I believe, off the top of my head, was the minimum decline applied.
And what was your economic limit?
In term of production, or in barrels a day.
Well, you would have had to decline this out to its economic limit.
Correct. We declined it out to the economic limit based on the fixed operating expense, and then the price tag applied at the time, which I believe was a flat 95 for last year.
Okay, so do you have an estimate of what it was on your economic limit?
The barrel per day probably around between 7 and 8 barrels a day.
Okay, well, make sure you include all that in the supplement. I'm moving to Exhibit 26. I'm still confused with this one. That there was a lot of things that were duplicate, and maybe it was just mislabeled. The upper portion, I believe what you said is where it says current conditions and calculations within the reservoir. That's at the end of phase one, is that right?
That was at the time of calculation.
When did you calculate it?
I believe that was July of 2022.
Your total estimated primary reserves of 655,000, that's based on what? It can't be based on your Exhibit 18 because you're almost 700,000 on it.
Right, and that's due to the varying price tags at the time that we ran it, the Exhibit 18 being based on the SEC reserves number, and then the July calculations were based upon the NYMEX strip pricing at the time.
And then the current conditions calculated within the reservoir at the very bottom here. Why do you have down the total primary recovery is 658,000?
And then again, that's due to those numbers being run at different times with different price tags.
Doesn't that make it extremely confusing when you have numbers flying all over the place?
It does, yes.
I tried to find the parameters that you used in your formula. I didn't see anywhere where you had them listed that these are what I used. I found a number of things that I could have guessed, but those number of things were different in different places. We definitely want you to list all the parameters and show the calculations on each one of the phases. We're only looking at 2 tracks here. It should be extremely easy, but we need to know what went in to make those calculations.
Certainly.
You know, I noticed the oil cum is different in 3 different places. The EUR was different in 3 different places. The unit EUR incremental is even different in a couple places. I assume that the remaining recoverable is the current, or the oil in place at the time that Phase 2 kicks in. That's what you said, I believe.
That's correct.
And did you use, what was it, 7.8% of that as your amount?
That's a great question. For the remaining recoverable oil in place,
Well, you, the remaining recoverable oil in place, you need to define that. I mean, are you talking about the remaining recoverable of primary, or the remaining recoverable, and it's not really remaining, but the secondary
secondary
recovery,
recoverable.
during EOR project?
right?
I mean, that's what I think we're talking about. It's Phase 2 that we're talking about. So how did you calculate that amount of oil that would be produced under enhanced recovery operations?
So it would have been from the recovery factor cumulative of what would be then produced from Phase 1 and from Phase 2 from that point forward was the remaining. So it was left to be recovered in primary recovery, and then also what would then be recovered during secondary recovery.
That was confused by your answer.
So the remaining recoverable oil in place number was what we anticipated recovering from both primary and secondary recovery from the point of calculation forward.
Okay, but we're talking about Phase 2 production, Phase 2 formula.
Correct.
So Phase 2 shouldn't include any
Include any
primary, right?
Right. But it did in this one.
Okay,
Let's
when you
see.
explained this before, I thought you said that you took the original oil in place, subtracted out the primary oil, so you had current oil in place, and took that times a recovery factor during secondary recovery operations.
For what would be left in the, for lack of a better word, swept by primary recovery in the northeast part of the reservoir. So where that contact had moved. We assumed that I believe we said 14% is recovered from primary mechanisms. So we applied that to the acreage, so basically assuming 14% of the oil that was in place for each acre of that reservoir had migrated south, leaving then 86% behind. And then we expect to recover the additional, I believe we had secondary recovery factor of 14 times 5.56 of 7.84 of that sweat portion would then be recovered still.
Well, go through that exercise in your supplement and send it in, and we'll go through it.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions from staff?
Tyler, if we take a look at Exhibit 27,
Yes.
when does your budget plan on making these expenditures, the well conversion, the potential flow line? When do you have those planned and budgeted?
So the facility build is planned for immediately upon approval, within a reasonable time frame of approval, so probably less than 90 days would be our target.
So that'd be yet this year,
This year, yes.
based on approval?
Based on approval. We'd want to get that done, and then we'd most likely be looking at, of course, it's going to be an approximate number, maybe about 12 months to install the flow line, and then that'll be based on how the plant performs, how much water is needed to maintain our VRR ratio, and that would be for converting the source water well, and then we would most likely install the flow line and convert that well at the same time.
So let me see if I understood that correctly. You would plan to build the facility and start injection by the end of this year?
Correct.
and then you're gonna truck water for at least 12 months.
Approximately, yes.
And then at that point, you'd make a decision whether to build the flow line or not. So that'd be like a 2025.
A 2025 project, 2020, late 2024, or summer 2025. Just depending on, there's of course other unforeseen circumstances. If we lost the number of production wells that were supplying the water to the water flood, we could need that water earlier. So there's some outlying conditions where it would need to be done sooner, but that would be our base plan, yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions from staff? Seeing none, I guess, before we redirect, I guess, did that raise any questions, Mr. Bender? Or?
I don't have any.
I just have a couple of questions, kind of following through what Mr. Helms was discussing, and maybe to clear in my own mind, just how you answered this question. I had asked you what the minimum amount of money you could spend to determine whether this project would be successful or not, and I believe your answer was $313,000. Is that correct?
It was, I could, to make sure it's that the project would be economic or that there would be an injectivity.
Okay, but in addition to that, wouldn't you also have to expend the $200,000 that you need under what's called unitization?
I believe that I'd said moving forward, the needed expense would be an additional 300,000, and then considering the money is already spent is sunk.
I guess I'm still confused. To get to the point where you can go forward, aren't you going to spend $200,000 on land and legal?
That's already been spent.
Okay,
So that's,
all right. So there's $200,000 there, and then an additional $313,000 that you're going to have to spend to build the injection facility and the tank battery, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So approximately $500,000.
cum to the first day of injection,
Okay.
yes.
And then a pipeline potentially at a later date.
That's correct.
Okay. Would you, I typically don't do this because I'm not with the commission, but would you object to providing a new Exhibit 24 that lays this out? I mean, this is confusing where you talk about $50,000 being the cost, but you've AFE'd for 75, and it doesn't talk about the 200, nor does it talk about the pipeline.
Does the commission want that?
The commission does want that.
Okay, thank you.
It'll be done.
That's all the questions I have.
Right, I guess, Mr. Mann, anything further in your intern
No.
here? All right. And with that, all right, well,
Sorry.
questions from commission staff?
Stephen, one more question that I missed in our original pass there. In talking about Exhibit 11, when you were talking about the identification of the oil water contact at the highest structural point.
Yes, sir.
At that point, there's a point along the wellbore around the 13,500 foot depth where it's approximately that same structural depth, correct? Similar?
Similar.
Okay. It would look, what is, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this. The dip of the reservoir, the Wurtzfield well, was it drilled slightly down dip?
I will refer us first to, we'll use, let's say, Exhibit 6, just so everyone can see a visual.
Maybe 5?
Or 5, work just as well.
You got a structure map on
Yes,
that one,
sir.
at least.
For the most part, as shown on Exhibit 5, with general bed dip, as shown with the subsea structural contours, the wellbore is almost drilled in an on-strike orientation to dip, so it's, I'm not sure you would say it's drilled up dip, or it's more toe up than toe dip, or excuse me, toe tip. Toe, more or less toe up versus just drilled up dip. I'd say it was, relatively drilled on strike.
Relatively flat on strike?
Yes.
Okay. So in some of those previous supplementals that I asked for, with respect to evaluating the horizontal logs and the mud log with respect to fluorescence and whatnot.
Yes, sir.
I would like a little bit of special attention paid to that interval where that gets to about the same structural depth.
Yes, sir.
And that's all I got. Thank you.
Any further questions?
Mr. Examiner, I don't know, we haven't set a date for when these supplemental exhibits are going to be filed, and frankly, we don't have to file anything, so I'm not, anxious to get those. But I am requesting that we have a certain amount of time to review those exhibits once they're filed with the commission, and request of Mr. Mann that he supplies copies when he files. And, we're talking about a lot of exhibits, and certainly not interested in delaying this entire process, but my initial request is going to be that we have 21 days after the receipt of those exhibits to respond.
Mr. Mann, any objection to a period of response there?
That's fine.
Okay. Well, yeah,
How long do we need to prepare those?
One issue we may have is the supplements that you file may not be exactly what we asked for, so we may want additional ones revised from that. How do you want to handle that, Lawrence?
That's difficult, but I think if we could have the 21 days for the initial set of exhibits, and if for some reason you request additional exhibits, if there aren't that many, perhaps we can respond to as few as 7 days. Like I said, I'm not interested in putting this off, but I do want to give my client an opportunity, so we may just have to handle that on a case-by-case basis. If you're requesting a lot more or totally different things or very complex, we're going to need more time. But I think we can probably respond if it's just a few exhibits in a 7-day period, so that would be my thought.
How would you feel if we made sure those exhibits were provided to you once we determined that we had what we wanted?
I don't have any objection to that. If you want to get the exhibits from Mr. Mann, and then you make a determination whether there's additional exhibits, and then we not submit a response until they're all in, I'm perfectly fine with that.
Does that work a little better?
I think that would probably make more sense for everyone unless, any objection, Mr. Mann?
No objection. How long do we need?
So we'll leave that at 21 days after we have that confirmation of the final.
That sounds good. Good idea.
Okay. I guess, what kind of time frame do you think?
Yeah, Mr. Examiner, if we could have 3 weeks from today for submission of ours.
My calendar's not moving. All right, so that would be what, Friday, May 19th?
And Mr. Examiner, would you have any objection if I were to put together just a short proposed order for you to execute so that there's no confusion as to how this is going to be handled? And of course, I'd run it past Mr. Mann before I send it to you.
Yeah, I guess I would.
Order on what?
An order on how the supplemental exhibits are going to be handled, that I don't have to respond until 21 days after the commission concludes that they have all the exhibits that they want.
I don't know if it's necessary. It's kind of on the record, but that's fine.
I suppose if, yeah, and if you want to talk together and have some agreed upon proposed language, I would be fine with that, but. So, all right, the record will remain open for supplements until May 19th. All right, and so I guess moving into maybe, I don't know if there's more statements to be made here, but there are a number of individuals present today who may wish to provide testimony. I will remind you there is a sign-up sheet at the front of the room, and I guess I'll allow Mr. Bender an opportunity to provide any argument if you'd like to at this time, and then I'll follow up with any other testimony that you may want to provide.
I don't have any arguments at this point in time. I think it might be more appropriate to wait until all the exhibits are before the commission.
And was there any other individuals that wanted to provide any testimony here today? Okay, I guess seeing none.
And Lawrence, just to be clear, you're not asking for another hearing after this, you're just wanting a response to be submitted after you get the supplements.
I'm not going to waive the opportunity to request a hearing. It's all going to be dependent on what's submitted. Hopefully not.
Yes, anything further on this matter, Mr. Mann?
No, Mr. Examiner, thank you.
And Mr. Bender?
Nothing further.
All right. And that will conclude the hearings in cases number 30043 and 30044. Thank you, everyone, for your time today.